Have you ever wondered what happens when someone challenges their own gods? And what if that challenge is so great that it results in eternal punishment? In today's video, we'll explore the story of Sisyphus, the man who dared to deceive the gods and paid such a high price that his punishment is never-ending. But is the real story behind Sisyphus's punishment really what everyone thinks? Get ready for an epic journey where we'll not only uncover the details of this relentless punishment, but also the lessons we can take from it. Stay with us until the end, because what you'll discover will completely change the way you see Greek myths and the power of human resilience. So if you're ready to dive into the truth behind Sisyphus's punishment, grab your key to knowledge and let's get started. Since he was a child, Sisyphus showed that he was different from the others. While other kids ran and played carefree, he observed everything around him, always alert. It didn't take long for him to realize that in the world, it wasn't the strongest who won, but the smartest. And cleverness was something he had in abundance. As the years went by, his intelligence and skill with words made him famous. Not only did he found Corinth, but he also transformed it into a prosperous city. He wasn't a beloved king, but no one could deny that he was efficient. He always knew what to say, when to say it, and most importantly, how to convince others to do what he wanted. The rulers of neighboring cities feared him, for Sisyphus was a master at exploiting situations to his advantage. The gods looked at him with suspicion, knowing that he didn't respect limits, not even divine ones. As for the people, well, the people just tried not to get too involved in his affairs, knowing that anyone who tried to deceive him always ended up being deceived. But Sisyphus didn't see any problem with this. On the contrary, the more he deceived and manipulated, the more powerful he felt. To him, life was a game, and he was the only one who knew all the rules. There was no challenge he couldn't overcome, no trick he couldn't unravel. The world seemed to be in his hands. The problem? When someone believes they are invincible, they eventually go too far. And Sisyphus, with all his cunning, would soon discover that not every trap could be avoided, especially when the gods decided it was time to settle the score. Sisyphus had many qualities, but patience wasn't one of them. So when he noticed that his herd was mysteriously shrinking, he didn't waste time lamenting. Someone was stealing his cattle, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Instead of chasing after the thief, he used his cleverness. He took a bucket of paint and carefully marked the hooves of the cattle with a subtle, almost imperceptible symbol. That way, when the animals were taken, he would have undeniable proof that they were his. Sure enough, the next morning, he followed the tracks and found his cattle grazing in a neighbor's pasture. A man known for his smooth talk, but clearly not as smart as he thought. Without hesitation, Sisyphus walked up to him and with a sly smile pointed to the cattle's hooves. Beautiful animals you have here, quite similar to mine, I'd say. In fact, identical. The neighbor tried to argue, swore his innocence, but Sisyphus already had his proof. And he wasn't just content with getting his cattle back, he wanted to walk away with even more. It was then that he met the thief's daughter. Beautiful, intelligent, and it seemed bored with the quiet life on her father's farm. It didn't take much to seduce her. A few well-chosen words, promises of a better life in Corinth, and soon she was by his side. When he left the neighbor's property, Sisyphus not only recovered his cattle, but also gained something more. And once again, he proved that his intelligence was his greatest weapon. The problem was that he was getting too used to always coming out on top. And fate, as we know, doesn't forgive excesses. Sisyphus ruled Corinth, but anyone who looked closely would realize that his concern was never for the well-being of the people. He wasn't cruel nor a tyrant, but he wasn't the kind of king who cared about justice or kindness either. His only interest was himself. In the palace, he was surrounded by advisors who were nothing more than puppets. No decision was made without him somehow benefiting. If someone asked for help, Sisyphus offered it, but only if there was a hidden benefit in the deal. Merchants who came to Corinth soon learned that nothing was obtained without a favor in return. Allies knew that his friendship was temporary, and enemies. Well, Sisyphus didn't worry about having enemies, because he always outsmarted them before they could become a threat. He manipulated disputes between neighboring cities to strengthen his position, diverted tribute without being caught, and created laws that favored his own interests. Nothing escaped his calculating gaze. His reign wasn't based on the love of the people, but on the fear of falling into one of his traps. But even the smartest make mistakes, and Sisyphus's mistake was thinking he could manipulate everything and everyone forever. Fate, relentless as always, would soon show him that there are forces that even he couldn't control. One morning, while watching the horizon from the top of his palace, Sisyphus saw something unusual. A massive golden eagle soaring through the skies, holding a struggling young woman in its talons. Her screams were muffled by the wind, and within moments the bird disappeared into the clouds. This wasn't just an attack by a bird of prey. Sisyphus had heard stories about Zeus, the king of the gods, and his habit of abducting mortal women. In various forms, he knew exactly what he had just witnessed, but instead of being alarmed, he simply smiled. This was valuable information. It wasn't long before a visitor arrived in Corinth, Sisyphus, the powerful river god, in search of his missing daughter. His face showed desperation, and his voice carried urgency. King Sisyphus, my daughter Aegina, has been taken by forces I do not understand. I know you are a shrewd and well-informed man. Did you see anything that could help me? Sisyphus crossed his arms and feigned a thoughtful expression. He could simply tell him what he saw, but where would the advantage be in that? His calculating mind was already working on a way to profit from this situation. Perhaps I can help you, noble Sisyphus, but everything has its price. The river god narrowed his eyes. And what do you want in return? Sisyphus's smile widened. He already had the answer on the tip of his tongue. Sisyphus knew that Sisyphus wasn't just any god. As the god of rivers, he had control over water, something extremely valuable for Corinth, a city that had always suffered from scarcity. So without rushing, the king leaned slightly forward and proposed his deal. I will reveal the whereabouts of your daughter, but I want something in return, he said, looking at the god with a calculating gaze. Bring a source of perpetual water to Corinth, a river that never dries up, that will guarantee life and prosperity to my city. Sisyphus hesitated. He didn't trust Sisyphus, as his reputation as a trickster had even spread among the gods. But he couldn't ignore the possibility of finding his daughter. His fatherly heart spoke louder. It's a deal, he said, extending his hand. A handshake sealed the agreement, and then, without hesitation, Sisyphus revealed what he knew. It was Zeus who took your daughter, he said with a half-smile. I saw him carrying her through the skies, disguised as an eagle. He must have taken her to one of his hiding places on Mount Olympus. Sisyphus's fury was immediate. The river that ran calmly beside Sisyphus's palace began to bubble, as though it was about to boil. The god briefly thanked him and left, leaving a trail of water in his wake. Sisyphus, for his part, merely watched with satisfaction as shortly afterward a new spring appeared around Corinth, pouring out crystal-clear water. His plan had worked. He had gained something valuable without taking any risks. What he didn't realize, however, was that by betraying Zeus, he had just signed his own sentence. On Mount Olympus, Zeus was known for his limited patience and unshakable pride. When he learned that Sisyphus had revealed his secret to Sisyphus, his expression turned to one of disbelief and fury. That mortal dared to betray me, he roared, his voice echoing through the celestial halls. He knew that Sisyphus wouldn't waste any time seeking revenge. And indeed, the river god was already descending from the mountains, causing floods and destroying lands in his fury, determined to rescue his daughter from the grasp of the king of the gods. Zeus couldn't allow his authority to be questioned by a mere mortal. He had already punished kings and heroes for much less. Gods were not betrayed, and Sisyphus needed to be an example to any other mortal who dared challenge him. Without hesitation, Zeus commanded Thanatos, the personification of death, "Go to Corinth, bring me the soul of this man, and make sure he never deceives anyone again." The decision was made. Sisyphus's punishment was about to begin, and, this time, not even his cunning could save him. Night was falling over Corinth when a shadowy figure crossed the gates of Sisyphus's palace. His black robes seemed to absorb the light of the torches, and the silver scythe he carried reflected a cold, threatening glow. It was Thanatos, the god of death, sent by Zeus to take the soul of the trickster king to the underworld. However, Sisyphus was not a man who was easily frightened. When one of his servants rushed into the throne room, pale and stammering about a terrifying presence, the king merely smiled. He had already suspected that Zeus would not let his betrayal go unpunished. "Let him in," he said, calmly adjusting his tunic. A few seconds later, Thanatos appeared in the hall. His presence made the air heavy, as if life itself were being drained from the atmosphere. The guards trembled, some even recoiling, but Sisyphus remained unfazed, studying the god with an analytical gaze. "King Sisyphus," said Thanatos, his voice echoing like a cold whisper, "your time has come. I've come to take your soul." Sisyphus slowly stood up, feigning resignation. He walked a few steps around the room, as if savoring his last moments, and then let out a theatrical sigh. "I always knew this day would come," he said with a melancholic tone. "But before I go, may I at least see the instruments of my fate?" Thanatos frowned. "What do you mean?" "Your chains, of course," replied Sisyphus, pointing to the dark shackles the god carried. "The famous chains that bind souls in the underworld. They say they're unbreakable. I'd like to see them up close, after all. I won't have another chance." Thanatos hesitated for a moment. No one had ever asked him for such a thing, but deep down, what harm could there be? He opened the chains, displaying the gleaming links. Sisyphus approached slowly, pretending to be in awe. "Incredible, truly magnificent. But how do they work?" he asked, his voice laden with curiosity. "How can someone be bound by them?" Thanatos, now intrigued, decided to demonstrate. He took one of the chains and looped it around his own wrist, showing how the links closed automatically. And that was when Sisyphus acted. In a quick, precise movement, he grabbed the chains and wrapped them completely around the god of death. Before Thanatos could react, the king pulled the links and locked them with a tight knot. The god shuddered, trying to break free, but it was too late. The very chains that imprisoned souls were now keeping him trapped. Thanatos howled in rage, but he could do nothing. Sisyphus had tricked him. The king stepped back, admiring his work with a satisfied smile. "It seems death has been captured," he said, crossing his arms. "And if death is trapped, no one else will be able to die." And thus, without realizing the consequences of his actions, Sisyphus began the chaos in the world of the living. Bound by his own chains, Thanatos struggled furiously, but every movement only made his shackles tighter. Sisyphus's satisfied gaze only increased his fury. "You fool of a mortal!" roared the god of death. "You have no idea what you've just done." But Sisyphus knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't just want to escape death. He wanted to control his fate. With Thanatos out of the picture, death would lose its power, and he, Sisyphus, would remain alive for as long as he wanted. Smiling, The king approached the prisoner and gave the immortal god a pat on the shoulder. "Oh, Thanatos, you underestimate my intelligence," he said, feigning regret. "It's nothing personal, of course. I'm just not ready to leave. And now it seems that no one else will need to leave either." And indeed, the world began to change. In wars, soldiers fell wounded, but did not die. In deathbeds, the elderly and the sick suffered endlessly, unable to give their last breath. Priests sacrificed animals to the gods, but the blades didn't take their lives. Everything seemed frozen between existence and the end. Soon enough, chaos overtook the cities. Without the presence of death, battlefields became an unimaginable horror, filled with warriors mutilated but still alive, groaning without being able to rest. Temples were overtaken by despair, as rituals that required sacrifices became useless. Even the gods themselves began to feel the effects of the imbalance. In Olympus, Hades, lord of the underworld, realized something was terribly wrong. His realm was silent. No new souls were crossing the river Styx. The ferrymen were idle, and the judges of the dead had no souls to judge. Furious, he turned to Zeus. "This is the work of that miserable mortal," he shouted. "He defied the natural order." Zeus had already known about the problem, but until then, he had been entertained by Sisyphus's audacity. However, what began as a small act of rebellion was quickly becoming a threat to the balance of the world. Something needed to be done. And so the gods decided to send someone who would solve the issue with brute force and no patience for games. Ares, the god of war. War, after all, had become useless without death, and Ares was not happy about that. With Thanatos imprisoned in the halls of Corinth, death ceased to exist. At first, mortals didn't notice the change. For many, it seemed like a miracle. Wounded warriors who should have fallen on the battlefields remained standing, even though their injuries were severe. The elderly and the sick, who had long been on the threshold of the underworld, now remained trapped in their fragile bodies, unable to die. Soon enough, chaos overtook the cities. Without death, the population grew uncontrollably. Prisons became overcrowded with criminals who could not be executed. Kings and rulers aged without ever being succeeded, holding power indefinitely. And in the battlefields, horror took on an even worse form. Mutilated soldiers, pierced by spears and arrows, continued fighting or crawling on the ground, unable to find rest. In Olympus, the gods began to grow restless. Hades, lord of the underworld, was furious. The natural flow of souls had been interrupted. The realm of the dead was empty. The ferrymen of the Styx had no work, and the judges of souls were bored, with no one to judge. "This is unacceptable," roared Hades, turning to Zeus. "My domain has been broken. The balance between life and death is ruined." Zeus, who was already irritated by Sisyphus's audacity, frowned. He had enjoyed the mortal's cleverness up until that point, but now he saw that the trick threatened the very order of the cosmos. "This needs to end," he declared. "We will free Thanatos immediately." But Zeus didn't need to decide who would carry out this task. Someone was already on the way, filled with fury and impatience. Ares, the god of war. Ares had realized that his battles no longer had purpose. Combat had lost its essence, for wounded warriors continued fighting, unable to fall. To the god of war, this was an intolerable affront. If death didn't return, war would become nothing more than a grotesque, meaningless spectacle. With his spear in hand and a gaze full of fury, Ares descended to earth, determined to resolve the problem once and for all. And Sisyphus, in his arrogance, had no idea he was about to face the wrath of one of the most violent gods in Olympus. Ares was furious. Wars, his domain, had lost their meaning. The blood spilled in battle was no longer enough to quench his thirst for conflict. Soldiers who died on the front lines didn't fall, and enemies no longer bowed before death as they should. The spears and swords that once reaped lives now seemed useless, like purposeless objects. The god of war was restless. How could he? The Lord of Destruction allowed this to continue. Without death, war, his great passion, was becoming an endless farce. Victories meant nothing, for there were no defeats to celebrate. There was no honor, no glory, just an endless cycle of unending struggle. With clenched fists, Ares descended from Olympus, enraged, ready to do whatever was necessary to restore the order the gods had planned. When he reached Zeus' throne, his presence dominated the space. He could wait no longer. "Zeus!" Ares shouted, his voice thunderous and filled with fury. "This game with death cannot continue. War is a battlefield, not an eternal spectacle. We need Thanatos back." Zeus, already aware of what was happening, looked at Ares with a cold calmness, but also with a touch of concern. He knew something had to be done. The realm of the dead was empty, and the order of the universe was being challenged by a mere mortal, Sisyphus. Something had to be done, and Ares was the right god for the job. "Go, Ares. Go to Corinth and retrieve Thanatos. End this torment." Zeus commanded with a wave of his hand that carried all the authority of the king of the gods. Without another word, Ares set off on his journey. There was no more time for speeches or plans. He headed directly for the palace of Sisyphus, determined to restore order and, at the same time, impose his own vision of war. Meanwhile, in Corinth, Sisyphus, who had already begun to feel the weight of his own choices, started to realize that the time for his cunning was running out. He knew that Ares' power could not be ignored, and that sooner or later his reign of deception would come to an end. But he was not ready to yield. The king knew Ares would come, and perhaps, just perhaps, he still had a card up his sleeve. Ares could no longer tolerate the chaos that had taken over the world. War, which had always been his domain, now seemed a hollow shadow of meaning. He needed to restore order, and for that, he knew he had to free Thanatos, the god of death, and ensure the balance of life and death was restored. With burning rage in his eyes and his war blade ready to cut through any obstacle, Ares made his way to Corinth, where Sisyphus kept Thanatos imprisoned. The god of war saw no reason to waste time on subtleties. If necessary, he would destroy everything in his path, and nothing could stop him from completing his mission. Upon reaching Sisyphus's palace, Ares immediately stormed through the gates. His steps echoed like thunder in the halls, and each movement seemed to make the air vibrate with the tension of a battle about to unfold. Ares already knew what he would find. Sisyphus, ever so cunning, would not surrender easily. The trickster king was in the throne room, as though he had been expecting the god of war's visit, but his usual smile, the one of someone who knew they had a card up their sleeve, was now replaced with a nervous expression, as though he were aware his time was running out. "I knew this would happen sooner or later, Ares," Sisyphus said, trying to keep calm, though fear was evident in his eyes. "Your game is over, Sisyphus," Ares said, his voice deep and filled with determination. "You cannot play with the order of the cosmos without paying the price." The god of war glanced at Thanatos, still imprisoned, and with an imposing gesture, ordered the chains to break. The metallic sound of the chains shattering echoed through the hall like a cry of liberation. Thanatos, who had been still and weakened by his imprisonment, slowly rose, a glint of fury in his eyes. "You trapped me, mortal," Thanatos said, his voice filled with anger, but also with a silent gratitude to the god of war who had freed him. Sisyphus, now without his tricks, and seeing the imminence of his punishment, did what he always did best. He tried to negotiate. "Ares, you don't need to do this. I can be useful to you. I am not your enemy. We can make a deal." But Ares was not interested in words or promises. War was not about bargains. He approached Sisyphus with a cold look, and without giving the king a chance to deceive the gods any further, he stepped back, leaving Thanatos with the freedom to take the final action. Thanatos advanced on Sisyphus with a swift and efficient motion. Sisyphus, who had always considered himself a master of manipulation, didn't have time to react. The king had fallen once again into his own traps. After Sisyphus's capture, Ares showed no mercy. He delivered the king of lies to the very gods of the underworld, as Zeus had ordered, and together with Thanatos by his side, they took Sisyphus to the shadowy realm of death. The journey there was long and silent, crossing Erebus, the vast region that separated the world of the living from the eternal realm of the dead. The air was dense and heavy, and Sisyphus, though defeated, did not seem completely broken. He knew that the underworld, with all its mysteries, was no easy destination to face. Upon reaching the gates of Hades, Sisyphus was met with a landscape that was completely unfamiliar to him, yet somehow familiar. The shadows were thick, light did not exist, and the only sound was the murmuring of the souls wandering there. Hades' palace, made of obsidian and shadows, loomed before him like a silent monster, ready to swallow the last spark of his cunning. However, instead of feeling despair, Sisyphus felt a shiver of curiosity. He had deceived even the gods, so the underworld, with all its grandeur, didn't seem so terrifying. Hades, the lord of the underworld, had an imposing presence, but Sisyphus didn't feel fear. He knew that even here, he had something no mortal should ever possess, knowledge about the gods, about the order that moved the universe. As he entered Hades' great hall, Sisyphus came face to face with the immortal Persephone, queen of the underworld, sitting beside her husband, who watched her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He soon noticed the softness in her gaze, an innocence that seemed out of place in the cruel greatness of her reign. "Ah, Sisyphus," Persephone said in a voice that seemed to echo through the room, as though speaking directly to the deepest recesses of his soul. "I see the gods have finally brought you here. We cannot let you deceive them like this. You, mortal, seem more clever than many immortals." Sisyphus, with his usual smile, the one of someone who always had something hidden, looked at her with a gleam in his eyes. "I'm not the only one who deceives, my lady. The gods play their own games, and I merely played mine." Persephone smiled back, but her smile was gentle and understanding, as though she saw more than anyone knew. She didn't seem as angry with the man who had caused so much turmoil in Olympus. Hades, on the other hand, watched everything with a cold, distant expression. He didn't care about Sisyphus's games. What concerned him was the balance of the world, and Sisyphus had disturbed that balance. "You are in my domain now," Hades said, his voice so grave it seemed to resonate deep within Sisyphus's soul. "And here you will not escape your punishments." Sisyphus, knowing that his wit would no longer be useful here, now prepared for what was to come. But as he looked at Persephone, he saw an opportunity. His agile mind began to devise the next move. While Hades and Persephone discussed Sisyphus' fate, he remained silent, observing every gesture, every word. He knew it wouldn't be easy to deceive the lord of the underworld, but Persephone seemed to be his only hope. She, with her gentleness, didn't seem entirely convinced that he was beyond redemption. He felt there was a crack in her perception, a space to deceive once more. Taking advantage of his humble posture, Sisyphus slightly bowed and looked at Persephone with a serious yet melancholy gaze. He knew his best chance lay in pretending to be someone remorseful. After all, the underworld, the place where the dead meet, was also the home of the repentant. His fertile mind worked non-stop, and the chance to reverse his situation was within reach. "My lady, you don't know," Sisyphus began, his voice soft, almost sad. "When I died, my wife Merope didn't perform the proper rituals. She didn't bury me correctly, and the souls of the dead cannot rest without this care." Persephone watched him closely, a look of doubt crossing her face. She knew that the rituals of the living were extremely important, but something about Sisyphus seemed false. She wasn't sure if he was trying to deceive her or if in fact there was some truth in his words. "What do you expect from me?" Persephone asked, her tone curious but maintaining her composure. Sisyphus moved even closer, looking into her eyes with a sincerity that made his words almost seem real. "If you allow me to return to the land of the living for just one day, I can guarantee that my wife will finally bury me as I deserve. That way, a man like me, condemned, can rest in peace. I wouldn't ask this if it weren't important, but I feel that if I don't do this, her mistakes and mine will continue, and nothing will be resolved." Persephone, touched by his words, hesitated. She knew it was risky, that it could be a trick, but she couldn't help but feel pity for the man before her. A man who seemed weaker than the cunning leader she had heard about in Olympus. She looked to Hades for support, but his gaze was as expressionless as ever. "Do you promise that you'll return right after, as you asked?" Persephone asked, a slight tension in her voice. She knew granting this permission was unprecedented, but something inside her made her believe that maybe Sisyphus was different from other mortals. Sisyphus nodded, a smile disguised as innocence forming on his lips. He knew exactly what he was doing. "I promise, my lady. Just let me correct the mistakes of the living, and I'll return to fulfill my punishment. It's the least I can do." Persephone, moved by the hope that her kindness would make a difference, nodded and with a magical gesture opened a portal. The air around Sisyphus vibrated with the energy of the underworld, and he felt his body revived. The light of the world of the living appeared before him, like a promise of temporary freedom. Before Hades could intervene, Sisyphus was already about to cross the portal. He looked at Persephone, a final conspiratorial glance before stepping into the world of the living, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't return anytime soon. The lie was already planted. The deception once again was in motion when Sisyphus crossed the portal and found himself in the land of the living once more. The sensation was almost indescribable. The air, fresh and scented with flowers, the gentle breeze that caressed his skin. Everything felt so distant, so unreachable when he was in the underworld. For the first time, he felt the true weight of his temporary freedom. He knew this chance wouldn't last long, but he was determined to savor every second. After all, he wouldn't be caught so easily again. But Sisyphus also knew that to deceive Persephone and escape forever, he would need an infallible plan. He couldn't let doubt catch him now. The trust Persephone had placed in him was his greatest advantage. Her naivety, as he had observed, was the weak link in the chain. The goddess had no idea that he never intended to return. As he walked through the hills, the wind caressing his face, he began to think about how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. The lie he had planted wasn't just about the rituals of his wife Merope. It was also a chance to continue his life, but now with the excuse that he was trying to correct the mistakes of the past. He knew that humans, like all mortals, were constantly in search of redemption, and he, Sisyphus, would play the role of the redeemer, but in a much more personal and selfish way. He headed for his city Corinth, where his wife waited. Deep down, he knew he shouldn't just ignore her, but part of him felt she was no longer the woman he had left behind. He didn't need her to continue his rise, but she was an important means to an end. Like a ghost from the past, he sought her, hoping that now, desperate to correct the rituals he had said were incomplete, she would do what he desired. When he found her, Merope was, as he had expected, once again immersed in the fear of guilt. She knew in some way that her husband's death hadn't been completed with the proper respect, and that tormented her conscience. However, she didn't know Sisyphus's true intention. At first, he acted humble, pretending to be guilty for leaving her behind. His performance was flawless, touching Merope's heart deeply, and she began preparing the funeral rituals as he had asked. But Sisyphus's true purpose was far from any act of repentance. He needed time. He needed the city to prepare for what was to come. He knew that the first thing he would have to do, when returning to the underworld, was deceive the gods once again. He wouldn't return. Never again. As Merope, her hands trembling, finished the rituals, Sisyphus prepared to take his next big step, the final escape. It was only a matter of time before Persephone realized her mistake, but he trusted she would take time to understand what he had done. After all, the plan was already in motion, and no god or mortal would be able to stop him. Sisyphus didn't know exactly how it would happen, but one thing was certain. He didn't want to live as a prisoner anymore, and now, more than ever, he was determined to be the only master of his destiny. Sisyphus felt the adrenaline running through his veins as he prepared to take the final step in his grand plan. The world of the living lay before him, and with it, a freedom he never imagined. He'd experience again. The weight of his death had been lifted, but only temporarily, and he knew he had to act quickly to ensure he wasn't caught again. With one last gesture of farewell to Merope, he quietly left the city of Corinth. While she, still mired in guilt and confusion, continued with the funeral rituals she believed were necessary for her husband's soul to find peace, Sisyphus had already charted his path. His mind was sharp, full of strategies and escape plans. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing would stop him now. He had controlled death before, and now he would control his own life. He traveled for hours, weaving through forests, across fields and over mountains he knew so well. The roads that had witnessed his reign as the ruler of Corinth were now empty for him. The way was clear, and in his mind, he was already distancing himself from any chance of being found. He had to stay out of the gods' sight, but not only that, he needed to create a new identity. Sisyphus knew he was a cunning man, but the divine forces were relentless. And Zeus, though angry with him, would never give up so easily on revenge. In the dead of night, he arrived at the edge of the sea where a small boat awaited him. It was a simple vessel, nothing flashy, but enough to let him sail beyond the known borders. He boarded with a satisfied smile on his face. On the horizon, the vastness of the sea seemed promising, like a large blank canvas where he could start. A new story, far from the gods' wrath. But he knew this was temporary. His enemies were out there, and eventually they would need to exact the price for his betrayal. However, as the wind whispered through the sails and the sea carried him, he felt invincible. Far from Corinth, he settled on a small, forgotten island, where time seemed to drag without hurry. The rumors of his death spread quickly, and few imagined that the cunning Sisyphus could have truly outsmarted death. On that island, he would live for some time, out of reach of any mortal or god. He was finally free. Persephone and Hades had not yet realized the deception. Sisyphus knew that the truth would eventually come to light, but in the meantime, he would live with the freedom he had always desired. The underworld, as fascinating and dark as it was nothing more than a prison for him. Now, Sisyphus had something the gods could no longer take from him, his own life on his own time. However, he was not foolish. He knew that even in the depths of his escape, the gods would never give up on him. Sooner or later, they would discover what he had done. True freedom is never eternal, he thought, but for now, control was in his hands. Now it was only a matter of time before Hermes found him or Persephone began to realize her mistake. But until then, Sisyphus was ready to play his game with the gods for a little longer. The days passed slowly and quietly on the island where Sisyphus had hidden. His cunning, which had always kept him one step ahead of his enemies, now seemed to turn into an art of living between the shadows. However, in the underworld, an unease began to take hold of Persephone. The goddess, gentle and pure of spirit, did not like deceit, and although she was confident in her judgment, something in Sisyphus's behavior began to feel wrong. Time passed, and she felt a pang of doubt in her heart. Her trust in him had been absolute, but now uncertainty began to cloud her mind. However, the real crisis was far from something she could resolve with a quiet reflection. Persephone, aware of her position and duties as queen of the underworld, noticed a series of unsettling events in her realm. The souls of the dead began to stir in an unusual way. The dead, who for generations had remained still and at peace, now showed signs of unrest. Something was wrong. As always, Hades was immersed in his own tasks and responsibilities, but Persephone's presence in his activities was becoming more and more vital. It was in a council meeting, when Persephone questioned Hermes about what might be happening, that the truth began to emerge. The messenger of the gods revealed, with a serious and grave expression, that not only had Sisyphus escaped death, but that he was now beyond any reach. Hermes had tracked the clever king's trail but had failed to find him. The explanation for the restless souls was then directly tied to what Sisyphus had done. He had challenged the balance of the world of the living and the dead, breaking the rules not just of mortality, but of the very flow of energy that kept souls in the underworld. Persephone, upon hearing this, felt a deep shock. It wasn't just a simple mistake. Sisyphus, with his skill in manipulation and deceit, had put the entire order of the underworld at risk, and worse still, he had broken her trust. The goddess, always sensitive to the feelings of others, was devastated. Her kindness and compassion had been used against her, and she didn't know how to fix this mistake without harming others. She went to Hades, who, with his calm demeanor, listening attentively, began to realize the impact of the situation. His gaze, usually unshakable, now reflected a shadow of concern. However, even he, the lord of the underworld, knew there was no more time to hesitate. The dilemma was great. On one hand, Sisyphus could not be left without punishment. On the other, the balance between the world of the living and the dead was at risk, and Persephone's trust in the judgment of the gods had been compromised. Hades, with his natural authority, decided that Hermes should be sent again to capture Sisyphus. But this time, without fail, the messenger of the gods was to bring the treacherous king back and ensure that he did not escape again. Hades's fury was not just against Sisyphus, but against all mortals who dared challenge the unchanging laws of the gods. The balance of life and death, which he and his wife had guarded with such responsibility, had been compromised. Although Persephone was still torn between her love for Sisyphus and her loyalty to the underworld, she knew the gods could not allow such transgressions to go unpunished. The true punishment was coming, and Sisyphus would soon feel the weight of his cunning and disrespect for all those who govern the fate of the dead. Sisyphus, though he had prepared for a life of disguises and precautions, could not foresee the magnitude of the hunt that was about to begin. On his remote island, he tried to ignore the growing tensions in the underworld. Sisyphus's sharp mind knew his freedom would never be eternal, but he had learned to adapt to any situation. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, as though an invisible shadow was drawing near, and that was exactly what was happening. Hades, determined to restore order and punishment, entrusted the task of capturing Sisyphus to Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Hermes, with his divine speed and ability to move between worlds, had the ability to track even the smallest traces left by any mortal, whether a simple human or someone who had challenged the gods. Now, with a clear mission and no room for failure, the messenger set off in search of the clever king. Hermes, using his winged sandals, crossed the skies with the speed of lightning, touching the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead. He traveled over mountains and valleys, crossing seas and deserts until a new clue led him to Sisyphus's small refuge. In the darkness of night, the messenger of the gods found traces of swift steps, marks left by a man fleeing from something greater than himself. Hermes knew that although Sisyphus was clever, he would not be able to hide forever. Meanwhile, Sisyphus, isolated on his island, began to realize that his safety was at risk. The wind, always a good ally, brought him rumors that the gods were once again on his trail. He knew he had made a risky choice, but he also knew he could not be the only one responsible for the failure of the gods. Deep down, he felt he had the right to escape, and that he should not be punished for his ability to deceive those who considered themselves invincible. However, the tranquility he had earned with such effort was about to be destroyed. Hermes, with his ability to find even the most hidden of fugitives, had finally arrived at the island where Sisyphus was hiding. He gently descended from the sky, his foot-winged sandals barely making a sound as they touched the ground. He knew that Sisyphus would not be easy to capture, he never was. But Hermes also knew that this time there was no more escaping. What was to come would not be an ordinary chase. Sisyphus, realizing Hermes' presence, prepared for yet another of his famous escapes. He had faced the gods before, and he knew that his fate would always carry a thread of hope. But there was something different about this moment. The pressure was stronger than ever, and he felt that his tricks were coming to an end. At that instant, Hermes' hunt became not only a physical pursuit, but a race against time. Hermes not only wanted to capture Sisyphus, but also to ensure that the world's order would be restored. The chaos caused by the clever king's escape was affecting the harmony between the living and the dead, and the gods knew they could no longer allow any more failures. Sisyphus's punishment, now inevitable, would not be just for him, but for all mortals who dared challenge the celestial powers. The mission that Hermes now carried on his shoulders was not just a task of capture, it was a matter of restoring the balance between the worlds and ensuring that the gods, whose authority should never be challenged, regained complete control over the fate of souls and mortals. Sisyphus's life, which had seemed to stretch endlessly, had reached a critical point. The immutable laws of fate were being ignored, and the very fabric of reality was becoming unstable. Hermes, aware of the urgency of his mission, spared no effort. He traveled through the mortal world with an agility that no human could comprehend, crossing lands and landscapes that seemed ordinary, but to him were merely stages of his relentless pursuit. However, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Sisyphus, as always, knew how to hide, how to change his tracks, how to distort others' perceptions. But Hermes had something that Sisyphus did not: the support of the gods. With every step he took, he felt the power of Olympus guiding his quest, like an invisible beacon lighting the way. The hunt dragged on for months. Hermes, despite his unmatched speed, had to learn to read the signs left by Sisyphus. Small clues, a broken leaf here, a shifted stone there, were the only traces of the trickster king. However, Sisyphus was cunning. He knew that if he were caught, his punishment would be crueler than anything he had ever faced. The underworld, with its chains and dungeons, would be an endless torture for someone who had become accustomed to manipulating the reality around him. Meanwhile, Sisyphus, though fearful of being found, couldn't shake the feeling that the inevitable was drawing closer. He tried to escape to the most remote places, sometimes relying on the winds to divert Hermes' watchful gaze. Yet, deep within him, he knew that the luck, which had always been in his hands, was starting to slip away. He had deceived death once, but the wrath of the gods was now closing in with far greater force. Hermes knew this. He had found him before, and it wouldn't be easy for Sisyphus to hide this time. Hermes' mission wasn't just about capturing an audacious mortal, it was about restoring order, ensuring that the balance Sisyphus had broken was brought back. For the messenger of the gods, there was something personal about the hunt. It wasn't just his duty, it was a matter of honor for the gods. As cunning as Sisyphus was, Hermes was not just a messenger, he was a god himself, a herald of Zeus, and his mission was backed by incomparable power. Without further doubts or distractions, Hermes felt he was very close to achieving his goal. And with that, a growing tension began to consume his journey. He was on the verge of reaching the end of a pursuit that had long been predestined. The moment of capture was finally at hand. Sisyphus felt the weight of inevitability, like an encroaching shadow wrapping around him. Even with his cunning, his tricks, and all the strategies he had used throughout his long life, he could not escape forever. The waves of destiny were about to close in on him. Hermes, relentless, continued his tireless search. He knew that Sisyphus was a master manipulator, but there was no more place for the trickster king to hide. The wrath of the gods was too great. And finally, in the silence of the night, Hermes found him. The island where Sisyphus was hiding was small, far from usual routes, a land of few resources and even fewer inhabitants. But to Sisyphus, this place represented his last line of defense, a final refuge where he could try to deceive the gods once more. He watched the horizon, always alert to the winds, the sounds, as if he could sense that he was about to be surrounded, and he was. With swift steps, Hermes descended from the sky, his winged sandals cutting through the wind with divine precision. There was no more time for manipulations or clever escapes. Sisyphus, in a final gasp of resistance, tried to hide in the island's dark caves, but there was no way out. Hermes had found him, and he could no longer be fooled. When the messenger of the gods appeared before Sisyphus, the trickster king, with a weary smile, looked into the god's eyes. "You may try to bind me, Hermes, but you know as well as I do that the gods cannot control luck forever," Sisyphus said, with an arrogance that had yet to fade. Hermes, however, was not there to negotiate or listen to empty words. "Your luck has run out, Sisyphus," he replied firmly. "The gods have the power to control your destiny, and you can no longer escape." With that, Hermes approached, his hands gently resting on Sisyphus's shoulders with the softness of an inevitable fate. There was no more chance for the cunning king. He was immobilized, unable to move, and his journey as a fugitive was over. There were no more deceits, no more tricks, no more escapes. Sisyphus was finally defeated. Sisyphus's gaze reflected the last trace of his resistance, but he knew that the truth had caught up with him. He could no longer escape the consequences of his actions. The return to the underworld was now an accomplished fact. Hermes led him back to the realms of the dead, where the gods awaited. Each step the messenger took toward the underworld was a reaffirmation of the gods' power, and a reminder that mortals could not defy the celestial order forever. The king of Corinth, who had been so skilled at escaping death, was now at the mercy of divine justice. The underworld once again returned to its normal rhythm. Sisyphus' presence, with his cunning and disrespect for the gods' laws, created a palpable tension. But the fate of all there was, sealed according to the will of the immortals. He would no longer have any chance to manipulate reality or escape. The cycle of life and death. His journey, which seemed endless, was now meeting an eternal punishment. Hades, lord of the underworld, was not particularly interested in prolonging Sisyphus's suffering. He had already been punished by Zeus, but the gods, as always, were mindful of the consequences. The decision was simple. Sisyphus had to pay for his crimes against divine order and for his attempt to cheat death itself. And so the fate of Sisyphus was sealed in a cruel and definitive manner. He was taken to Tartarus, the darkest and most isolated section of the underworld, a place so remote and terrifying that even other dead souls avoided it. There was no light, no relief. The echo of pain and despair filled the air. It was a space for relentless punishments, where the greatest criminals and those who defied the gods were condemned to spend eternity. When Sisyphus arrived in Tartarus, he was met with one of his worst trials. His eyes opened to what would be his endless existence, an endless punishment, a task without purpose, designed to break even the most resilient spirit. He was placed before a massive rock, an enormous mass of stone, that he had to push to the top of a steep mountain. It seemed simple, but the punishment lay in the essence of the task. Every time Sisyphus was about to reach the peak, when the rock was almost at the top of the mountain, it would roll back down, forcing him to start all over again. It was an endless cycle, an unending motion, a futile effort that stripped him of any hope. Sisyphus, as always, fought against the new reality. He grumbled, cursed, and even there, in his most desolate condition, tried to find a way to escape, just as he always had. But it was a futile attempt. The punishment was more than physical. It was psychological. Every day, the rock would descend, and with it, Sisyphus's dreams of a better future would fade. The rock, cold and unfeeling, symbolized the relentless will of the gods. It showed no mercy. Unlike any of his clever manipulations, this task did not depend on intelligence, strength, or persuasion. There was no way out. He was trapped in a cycle that even his cunning could not break. Over time, what remained of his rebellion was consumed by the relentless effort. Sisyphus slowly began to realize that his struggle, no matter how fierce, had no end. He could not cheat death this time, and, as expected, the immensity of the punishment left no room for more tricks. He had been defeated not only by the gods, but by the very impossibility of his mission. Tartarus became his home. Each passing day was a reminder of the weight of his choices, the arrogance that led him to defy even the gods. The rock, his eternal companion, rolled down the mountain once more, carrying with it the last shred of his hope for freedom. Tartarus stretched out before Sisyphus like an endless expanse, a place of eternal shadow where the echo of ancient screams and despair blended with the sound of the wind that never ceased. But Sisyphus's true torment was not in the darkness nor the emptiness. It was in the stone, in the relentless task imposed on him by the gods. He looked at the rock again, large, massive, and unforgiving. Its shape was monstrous, and its weight seemed to increase with every attempt to push it up the mountain. He knew what would come next. He would push the stone to the top, only to watch it roll back to the starting point, and the pain of failure would renew itself. But even knowing this, the king of Corinth could not stop trying. It was in his nature. Even now, when the impossible had become his only reality, he could not stop fighting, as if the struggle were a way to preserve his humanity. Sisyphus's hands were bleeding. His joints ached with the weight of the stone and the effort to push it. But for him, that effort was more than a mere physical task. It was an obsession, a continuous movement that reflected the weariness of his soul. Every time the rock descended, Sisyphus felt a part of himself disappear, no longer the cunning and manipulative king, but a broken man, wrapped in an endless cycle of futile labor. But the cruelest part was not just the constant effort, but the feeling that he would never get anywhere. There was no reward, there was no success at the end of his struggle, only the eternal repetition of the motion. Push the rock to the peak, only to see it tumble down again. It was a mental torture, as deep as the physical one. Time seemed to drag, and each day merged into the next, with no distinction, for the task was the same. Immortality was no longer a blessing for Sisyphus, but a curse, for he would never rest. At first, he tried to hold on, believing that perhaps with time he would find some way to outwit the gods, that perhaps he would discover a trick, like so many times before. But soon reality set in. There were no more tricks, there were no more exits. He was trapped in his own creation, in his own stubbornness. It was as if the gods had found the perfect way to punish him. They needed nothing more than his own condition. They didn't need to destroy him physically, because the worst punishment was watching the hope of success fade before his very eyes over and over again. With each failure, with each return to the starting line, Sisyphus felt his spirit dim a little more. As time passed, Sisyphus began to understand. It was not just a rock he was trying to push. He was trying to push his own fate, trying to avoid the inevitable, as he had done throughout his life. But now he was just a shadow of the man he had been. The king of Corinth had become a prisoner of his own arrogance, condemned to an endless task. His punishment was not loneliness nor physical pain. It was the despair of emptiness, the lack of any real purpose, which consumed him at every moment. Tartarus, with its echo of eternity, would never free him. And the rock, like life, would never give him a break. It was Sisyphus's punishment, the torture of a meaningless task, an endless chore that represented not only the lack of redemption, but the inability to see any meaning beyond the endless. Repetition. Time in Tartarus was an abstraction for Sisyphus. There were no markers of day and night, no rhythm of the seasons. Only the unceasing weight of the rock, which he pushed without rest. What might once have been called days was now just an infinity of moments devoid of meaning. He was so immersed in his task that the line between the present and the past had become unrecognizable. The curse he carried was not only physical, but a mental prison that corroded him from within. As Sisyphus pushed the stone up the mountain, his mind, usually sharp and full of strategies, began to falter. He found himself losing pieces of his humanity, as if his intelligence, once his greatest virtue, was being sucked out by the very repetition of his punishment. His mind was no longer capable of conceiving any way out, any means of deceiving fate. He began to wonder if he would ever be able to perceive the difference between one day and another, or if the cycle would become his only reality. No matter how much he tried to divert his thoughts to other memories, the grandeur of Corinth, his ability to manipulate, the adrenaline of conquest and betrayal, nothing seemed to have value anymore. All that was left was the stone, which rolled back down every time he was about to see it reach the top. With each passing day, the feeling of futility grew. He knew that this repetition would be his eternity. He looked at the mountain one last time, trying to find some meaning, some hidden purpose in his suffering. But what awaited him was only emptiness, the vast silence of the underworld. The rock seemed to stare back at him, unrelenting, as an extension of his punishment, challenging him to try again. But Sisyphus knew that the rock was much more than a stone. It was a symbol. It represented the total absence of redemption. Every movement, every effort was futile, a battle against the impossible. His muscles were numb, his body exhausted, and yet the rock continued to descend. Eternity, he thought, was a curse in itself. There was no redemption, no end. Like an incurable wound, he would never heal from his arrogance. He was trapped not only in this task, but in the very essence of his punishment, the recognition that he would never win. Tartarus, with its heavy air and the sense of no escape, became the setting for his eternal distress. Time no longer passed, and the solitude, which once could have been a refuge, now turned into his greatest enemy. The absence of all hope, the impossibility of changing his fate, made the mountain and the rock feel even more oppressive. Sisyphus, the man who once defied the gods with his intelligence, was now completely at the mercy of the inevitable. with nothing that could change him. The eternal repetition of his task, the constant movement without progress, became clearer. To him, his punishment was the very illusion of a purpose. The rock rolling down every time he was about to complete it symbolized what he had lost, the ability to achieve something lasting, the hope for a better future. He finally understood, or perhaps forced himself to accept. The punishment was not only physical, but psychological. The eternity of endless suffering was the true prize of the gods, and in the end, it was not the pain that tormented him most, but the awareness that there was nothing more. There was no escape, no redemption, no after. He was lost in a cycle, a prison without beginning or end. Over time, the story of Sisyphus spread to every corner of Greece. Those who heard of the man who had defied the gods, only to be punished with an eternal and futile task, began to understand something profound about the nature of existence. The lesson Sisyphus brought was not just about his endurance or his cunning, but about the consequences of challenging human limits and trying to deceive the gods. In his eternal struggle, the figure of Sisyphus became a symbol. He was no longer the king who had ruled Corinth, nor the clever man who deceived everyone with his tricks. He was now the embodiment of endless suffering, of work without reward, of effort that would never be rewarded. The story of his punishment would become an eternal reminder for those tempted to challenge the will of the gods or to believe they could control fate. But the most interesting thing of all was that even in his agony, Sisyphus did not give up. Although he was trapped in his endless task, there was something deeply human in his resistance. In his continuous failure, he still maintained a spark of dignity. He did not accept defeat. He kept pushing the rock, as if each time were his last attempt, as if a miracle could occur. And by doing so, he offered a lesson not just about the consequences of arrogance, but also about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. In reality, the true curse of Sisyphus was not the stone. It wasn't the punishment imposed by the gods, but rather the idea that his effort was completely futile. However, by persisting, he taught that the struggle itself, though endless, also had value. He showed the world that even in the face of the absurd, continuous struggle can have meaning, even if it's not to achieve a goal or a reward. The very act of persisting, of continuing to try, became a form of resistance to the absurdity of existence. Deep down, perhaps that was what the Tartarus could never consume, the quiet resistance of a man against what seemed impossible. The expression Sisyphean task would be used for centuries afterward to describe any task that seemed useless, an endless effort where the outcome never materializes. But it would also be remembered as an example of how the human soul can endure even the harshest trials. In his eternity of suffering, Sisyphus not only taught the world about the limits of ambition, but also about the greatness that lies in persistence, even when there is no longer hope. He would continue, as always, to push his stone, because despite everything, he was still Sisyphus. And as the stone rolled down once again, he would rise to try again, because his struggle, in all its pain, still had meaning. Resistance in the face of the impossible. And no matter how many times the cycle repeated, he would never stop fighting. So what do you think of the story of Sisyphus? No matter how much fate tries to challenge us, resistance and perseverance will always have their value. If this story made you reflect on the meaning of struggle and persistence, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed the video, like and share it so more people can discover this incredible journey of one of Greece's greatest myths. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We have many more fascinating stories and lessons from mythology to explore together. See you in the next video, and remember, never stop fighting, even if the stone rolls back.